The human soldier chose the most reclusive alien princess as his prize. Part 1. The war that ended with a human standing alone. The galaxy had been on fire for 6 years. Not a fire that burns and fades. The kind that spreads slowly, system by system, swallowing everything in its path, and leaving nothing behind worth saving. The Valtoran Dominion had started it, as most terrible things start, quietly, with paperwork and policy, with borders pushed a little too far, with demands that were just polite enough to be ignored, until they weren't polite anymore. By the time the first real shots were fired, half the galaxy had already lost something it was never going to get back. The Dominion was not one species, it was 7, bound together under a single banner of military superiority, and the belief that the strong had a right to take from the weak, because that was simply how the universe worked. They had numbers. They had ships. They had centuries of experience breaking civilizations that thought they were ready for war, and turned out not to be. The Cathari republics fell in the second year. A proud people, old and wise, with a fleet that looked impressive on paper. They lasted 4 months once the real fighting started. The Sorvian Armada, which had never lost a war in recorded history, shattered in year 4. The Drenai Empire, ancient and vast, with cities older than most species' written languages, surrendered quietly in year 5. Their emperor broadcast his capitulation from a golden hall, while Dominion soldiers stood behind him in neat rows. One by one, the lights went out, and then humanity stepped into the dark. Nobody expected much. Humans were young by galactic standards, barely 200 years into serious space travel, still arguing among themselves about politics and borders, and who owned which asteroid. Their fleet was small. Their technology was good but not exceptional. Their soldiers were trained well, but so were the soldiers of every civilization the Dominion had already crushed. The Dominion's senior strategists gave humanity 11 months before total collapse. Some of the more generous estimates said 14. Those strategists were wrong. Humanity did not fight like any species the Dominion had faced before. They did not fight to hold ground, they did not fight to protect supply lines, or maintain order, or preserve the shape of the war they had planned for. They adapted in real time, in ways that confused enemy commanders who had spent decades learning the predictable logic of how civilized species made war. Human soldiers retreated when they were supposed to hold. They attacked when retreat was the only rational option. They found angles and tunnels and timing that made no strategic sense, until suddenly, all at once, it made complete and devastating sense. They also refused to stop. That was the part that broke the Dominion's models. Every other species had a threshold, a point of loss beyond which surrender became the logical choice. Humans had a threshold too, but it was located somewhere so far past where any reasonable calculation placed it, that for all practical purposes, it did not exist. 6 years of war, cities lost, ships destroyed by the hundreds, soldiers buried on planets they had never seen before and would never see again. And still humanity pushed forward, grinding, bleeding, adapting. Sergeant First Class Cole Navarro was not famous at the start of the war. He was 26 years old, from a small city in the southwestern part of North America, the kind of young man who had always been better at listening than talking, and who had joined the military not out of any dramatic impulse, but because it was the thing in front of him that made sense. He was not the largest man in his unit. He was not the loudest. His evaluations described him consistently as calm under pressure, exceptionally observant, and hard to read. He became famous at the end of the war, during the final siege of the Dominion's command station above the moon of Verath. The plan had been to bombard the station from a distance, force a surrender, end it clean. The plan failed in the first hour when the Dominion activated a shield system that no human intelligence had known about. The bombardment became useless. A diplomatic channel was attempted, it was ignored. The war, which had seemed so close to ending, suddenly had no clear path to its end. Cole gathered 12 soldiers, looked at the schematics of the station, and proposed a breach. It was not a popular proposal. 3 layers of reinforced hull plating, 17 documented enemy checkpoints between the outer wall and the command center. A reactor core that the station's own crew would destroy before allowing capture, according to every known protocol the Dominion had ever published. His commanding officer called it a death sentence, dressed up as a plan. Cole said he would go anyway. 9 soldiers agreed to go with him. They burned through the outer hull with equipment not technically designed for that purpose. They moved through the first checkpoint before the alarm had time to fully sound. They lost 2 soldiers at the 4th checkpoint, 2 more at the 8th. The reactor started its self-destruct sequence when they were still 6 minutes from the command center. Cole did not stop. He came out the other side alone, every member of his team either dead or too injured to continue, the reactor behind him cycling through its final countdown. He walked into the command center, crossed the floor while Dominion officers reached for weapons they did not get a chance to use, and took the Supreme Commander of the Valtoran Dominion by the collar of his uniform. He broadcast the surrender himself, using the commander's own communications array, his voice flat and even, as though he were reading a grocery list. The war ended. 3 weeks later, the Allied species who had been liberated from Dominion rule gathered aboard the neutral station of Aravel's Crossing for the Peace Summit. It was a large and complicated event, full of species who had old grievances with each other and new grievances born from the war, all trying to agree on what the galaxy was going to look like from here forward. Humanity was given a full seat at the Galactic Council table, a recognition that would have seemed impossible a decade earlier. As part of the peace ceremony, the elder races invoked an ancient tradition called the Warrior's Prize. It was a custom older than most of the species in the room, a formal acknowledgement that the greatest warrior of a winning coalition could claim any single gift within the power of the gathered nations to grant. Land, ships, a treasury, a title, anything that could be given. Cole sat in the council chamber in his worn combat jacket, in a room full of alien delegates dressed in their finest ceremonial garments, and he looked around at all of them for a long moment before he spoke. "Who is the person," he said quietly, "that nobody wanted to bring to this table?" The room went very still. Sarath, the elderly Cathari delegate, an insectoid creature with 6 arms, and a face that communicated mostly through the angle of its antenna, turned his head slowly toward the human, and clicked his mandibles 3 times, a sound that translated roughly as startled disbelief. "You cannot mean," Sarath said, "the Veil Princess." Cole set his hands flat on the table. He did not lean forward, he did not raise his voice. He simply looked at the old delegate and said, "Tell me about her." The room was very quiet for a very long time. The human soldier chose the most reclusive alien princess as his prize. Part 2. The Princess Who Lived in Silence. Her name was Sail Vorn Ithe. She was the 3rd daughter of the late Veil King, and she was 29 years old, and she had never once in her life attended a public event, sat at a formal table, or stood in a room with more than 4 people at the same time. Not because she was kept away from the world, but because the world for her was simply too loud. The Veil were not a loud species in the ordinary sense. They did not shout. Their cities were calm, and their architecture was built around open spaces and soft light. They were known across the galaxy as gifted diplomats, as philosophers, as empaths in the truest sense of the word. A species that felt the emotional presence of others, the way most beings feel temperature, passively, constantly, as naturally as breathing. Every Veil was born with this gift to some degree. It made them excellent at reading rooms, at understanding conflict before it became conflict, at building the kind of trust that took other species decades to develop. It was the foundation of their entire civilization, this ability to feel each other, to know without being told. Sail had been born with that gift turned all the way up. For most Veil, sensing the emotions of others was like hearing quiet music in the background of a room. Pleasant, manageable, easy to set aside when focus was needed. For Sail, it was the opposite. Every person around her was a full orchestra playing at full volume directly in her mind. The louder the emotion, fear, excitement, anger, grief, the more overwhelming the sensation. A crowded marketplace felt to her the way a sonic cannon would feel pressed against a human ear. A formal gathering was worse. A room full of political tension, of competing fear and pride and calculation, was something close to agony. She had not been diagnosed with weakness. Her people did not have a word for what she was that meant broken. They simply understood, after careful years of observation, that she was amplified beyond what daily life could accommodate, and that she required a kind of quiet that ordinary Veil society could not give her. So, they had given her a tower. It was not a punishment. It was, in its way, a kindness. A beautiful stone tower at the edge of her homeworld's quietest forest, surrounded by nothing but trees and wind and the distant sound of a river no one used. She had 2 servants, both elderly, both trained over decades to move through her space with minimal emotional noise. They had learned to set their worry aside before entering a room. They had learned to breathe slowly. They had learned that the best way to care for her was to be present without being felt. She had spent most of her life reading, thinking, walking her 2 forest paths at dawn and dusk, writing long, careful letters to her father that he answered with equal care, letters that said more in their quiet sentences than most royal correspondence said in pages of formal language. When her father died, 2 years before the war ended, she had sat alone in her tower for a week and felt the grief of an entire nation roll over her in waves she could not stop or soften, and she had understood for the first time how much of what she carried was not her own. She was not unhappy. That was the thing most people outside her world got wrong when they heard about her. They imagined a tragic figure, isolated and miserable, pining for a life she could not have. But she had built a real life inside her limits. She had her books, and her forest, and her letters, and her 2 old servants, who had become, over the long, quiet years, something close to family. She had learned to find beauty in stillness. She had learned that most of what people called loneliness was really just the absence of the right kind of quiet company. She simply had not found that company yet. When the Veil Council sent a representative to her tower to explain what had happened at the summit, that a human soldier, the one who had ended the war, had invoked the warrior's prize and asked specifically about her. She was sitting by her window reading a book about the geological history of a planet she had never visited and would likely never visit. She set the book down slowly. She asked if the soldier had been told what she was. The representative said yes. She asked if he had been told what life near her required, the quiet, the distance, the restraint. The representative said yes. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked a question that surprised the representative completely. She asked what the soldier was like when he was not in a room full of people. The representative did not have a clear answer to that. He described Cole in terms of his military record, his rank, his actions, the siege of the command station. She listened to all of it without changing expression. When the representative finished, she looked back out the window at the trees and said she would agree to meet the human once, under conditions she would set herself. If the meeting went badly, the matter would be considered closed. She sent 3 conditions to the summit. He was to come alone. He was to come without weapons. He was to come in plain clothes, with no insignia, no rank marker, no ceremony. Cole agreed to all 3 without asking for changes or explanations. He arrived at her homeworld 6 days later, took a small transport to the forest's edge, and walked the rest of the way on foot. He found the tower in the late afternoon, with the light coming golden through the trees, and the air carrying the smell of something like pine, but softer. He stood in the courtyard, looked at the closed door, and sat down on the stone steps. He did not knock. He did not call out. He simply sat, hands loose in his lap, and looked out at the tree line. One of the elderly servants watched him from an upper window for 40 minutes before going to tell Sale that the human had arrived, and that he was, in her exact words, just sitting there, doing nothing at all. Sale came to the window and looked down. He was not what she had expected. She was not sure what she had expected. Some version of the loud, forceful energy she associated with soldiers, with people who were used to taking up space and demanding things. But there was nothing demanding about him at all. He sat on the steps the way old trees stand in fields, simply present, taking up only the space he needed, generating no particular noise in the part of her that always listened. She stood at her window for a long time. After 2 hours, she went downstairs and opened the tower door. He did not stand up quickly. He did not turn around with a wide smile or open arms. He turned his head slightly, acknowledged her with a small nod, and shifted a few inches to one side on the step, creating space, not filling it. She stood in the doorway. He sat on the step. Neither of them spoke for a while. Finally she said, "You are very quiet for a creature that just ended a war." He thought about it for a moment, the way a person thinks about something they have not needed to put into words before. Then he said he had always found that most things did not need noise to be real. She looked at him for a long time after that. He did not look back directly. He kept his eyes mostly on the trees, giving her the space to look, without the pressure of being looked at in return. She did not sit down that day, but she stood in the doorway for nearly an hour, and when she finally went back inside, she did not close the door all the way. The two old servants, watching from the upper window, looked at each other and said nothing. But the older of the two, a woman who had tended this tower for 30 years and had learned to read the small signs better than anyone alive, noticed the color of Sale's markings as she climbed the stairs. They were not gray. They were not the pale, cold white of discomfort, or the sharp, bright red of pain. They were the faintest, softest blue, the color her people associated with the very beginning of curiosity. The human soldier chose the most reclusive alien princess as his prize. Part 3. What it costs to stay. The Galactic Council had a version of events in their heads that went like this. The human soldier would escort the Veil Princess back to human space, install her in some impressive residence, show her off at a few important functions, and gradually fold her into the political machinery that always followed a war's end. She would become a symbol of the alliance. He would become a celebrated figure. Everyone would benefit. Cole did none of that. 2 weeks after his first visit to the tower, he came back to the forest. Not to the tower, to the forest itself. He found a small stone house about 200 meters down the road from Sale's tower, a place that had been empty for years, its roof patchy and its garden completely overtaken by weeds. He negotiated a rental with the local land registry, moved in with a single bag of personal belongings, and got to work fixing the roof. The council received a brief message from him explaining that he would be staying in the area for some time. No further details were given. Serath, the old Kethari delegate who had been watching this situation with more personal interest than his official role required, reportedly read the message 3 times. Then he set it down and made a note in his private journal that the human was either the simplest person he had encountered in 50 years of diplomacy, or the most complicated one, and he could not yet determine which. Cole learned the rhythms of the forest. He learned through careful and patient observation over the first 2 weeks that Sale walked the eastern path at dawn and the western path at dusk, always alone, always at the same unhurried pace. He arranged his own routines to keep him away from both paths, unless she chose otherwise. He planted a garden in the overgrown patch beside his house. He repaired a section of the low stone wall that ran along the edge of the property, a section that had been crumbling for what looked like several years, and that nobody had gotten around to fixing. The 2 elderly servants watched him work from a distance. They were cautious by nature and protective by long habit. But he never approached the tower uninvited. He never stood in the road, waiting to intercept her. He simply lived 200 meters away and let the space between them be exactly what she needed it to be. On the 8th day, she appeared at the edge of the tree line while he was weeding the garden. He did not look up immediately. He finished the row he was working on, set down his tool, and then looked over at her in the same easy way he might look at a bird that had landed nearby, noticing her without making the noticing into a performance. She stood at the tree line for a while. He went back to the garden. After some time she walked back into the trees. He did not follow. This was how it began. She started appearing at the edge of the tree line every few days, sometimes standing still for only a minute or two, sometimes staying longer. He behaved the same way each time, noticing her, continuing what he was doing, making no demands. She was testing something, though she would not have used that word. She was learning what he was like when he thought there was nothing to perform for. He was the same every time. On the 15th day, she walked across the open ground and sat down on the low stone wall he had repaired. He was sitting on his own doorstep with a cup of something warm in his hands, looking at the garden. She sat on the wall and looked at the same garden. They did not speak for a while. She said eventually that the carrots he had planted were in the wrong kind of soil. He said he had suspected that, but had planted them anyway to see what would happen. She said that was not a very efficient approach to gardening. He said he had always found that watching something fail taught him more than reading about why it might fail. She looked at the carrot patch. She said that was an unusually patient way to learn things. He said he had time. After that the wall became her place, when she wanted to be near without being too near. She brought a book sometimes, and read while he worked. He made no ceremony of her presence, no extra attention, no careful conversation, no visible effort to impress. He just went about his day in the way he would have gone about it alone, and she existed in the edges of it, the way the forest existed in the edges of the house, present, natural, not requiring anything. He started leaving things on the path between their homes. A flat river stone with an interesting shape. A small book about the native trees of her homeworld that he had ordered from a local seller in the village. A pressed flower from the garden, the kind that grew in the wall's cracks, and that she had once glanced at for a moment longer than necessary. He left these things without notes, without expectation, without standing around to see her reaction. She started leaving things in return. A small carved wooden figure of something like a fox, but not quite. A page of Veil script with a careful translation folded beneath it. A flat piece of bark with a pressed leaf attached, from a tree on the eastern path that had unusual vein patterns she had looked at for years. Once, a covered dish left warm on his doorstep with a folded piece of paper tucked under the lid that said, simply, "You forgot to eat again." He had forgotten to eat. He often forgot when he was working. They started talking more, in the way two quiet people talk, when they have both spent enough time in each other's orbit to trust the silence between words, slowly, carefully, choosing what to say with the kind of attention most people reserve for writing, not speaking. He told her about the war in pieces, not the battles, not the strategy, not the numbers, the weight of decisions made in the dark. The specific loneliness of being the person everyone around you is waiting on to say the next thing. The way grief for the people he had lost came not all at once, but in small moments, at unexpected times, reaching for a tool and remembering someone who used to make a particular joke about that exact tool. Or waking at 3 in the morning with the clear and pointless knowledge that someone was gone who should not have been. She did not offer solutions or reassurances. She sat with what he said the way she sat on the stone wall, present, still, not trying to make it into something else. He learned later that what she was doing had a name in her culture. Vorath, the act of sharing the weight of another person's pain so they did not have to carry it entirely alone. She could not stop herself from feeling what others felt. That had always been true. but she could choose what to do with it. She could carry some of it for him, quietly, without making it a transaction. She told him in return about the night the Dominion fleet first appeared above her homeworld. She had been in her tower. The fear of an entire city had hit her from 10 kilometers away, like a wall of cold water. Millions of people afraid at the same moment, their terror compressed into a single wave that had knocked her off her feet and left her unable to speak for 3 days. She told him this simply, without dramatizing it, the way someone describes an old scar. It happened, it was real, it is part of the map of me. He was quiet for a long time after she said that. Then he said he was sorry she had carried that alone. She looked at the garden for a moment. Then she said she had not known until recently that there was another way. The old servant who sometimes sat near the open window on warm evenings reported to her colleague that the human and the princess had talked for 2 hours that afternoon. The colleague asked what they had talked about. The old servant thought about it and said, "The hard things." The human soldier chose the most reclusive alien princess as his prize. Part 4. The thing that tried to break the quiet. Peace, in the galaxy's long experience, never lasted long before someone decided to complicate it. The Dominion had been broken. Its 7-member species had been scattered. Their military command dissolved. Their central government replaced by a temporary oversight council that was supposed to hold things steady while something more permanent was built. That process was slow and messy and full of competing interests, and the silence left behind by the end of a long war had a way of filling up fast with ambition. 3 of the newly liberated species had begun moving carefully against each other, quietly expanding their influence into the space the Dominion had left behind. Political alliances were shifting. Old grievances between peoples who had been allies only because they shared an enemy were surfacing now that the enemy was gone. The peace, in short, was real but fragile, and there were people on every side who understood that a fragile peace could be steered in useful directions if you applied pressure in the right places. It was in this environment that someone decided Cole Navarro was a useful story. The narrative started small, the way bad narratives always do. A single editorial in a minor Cathari political journal, not particularly well written, arguing that a human soldier, using an ancient alien custom to claim a veiled princess, was not a romantic gesture, but an act of colonial entitlement. That human civilization, newly arrived at the galactic table, was already demonstrating that it understood power only as a thing to be taken, that the princess had no real choice in this arrangement. The editorial was wrong about almost everything, but it was useful to the right people, so it traveled. Within 3 weeks it had been reprinted, reframed, and amplified across 40 news networks in 7 different species media. The story lost details as it moved. Sale's 3 conditions, Cole's compliance, her written confirmation that she had agreed to the meeting, all of it fell away. What remained was the simplest version. A human soldier had claimed an alien princess as a prize of war. It was the kind of story that was almost impossible to fight, because it was almost impossible to disprove in a way that satisfied people who had already decided to believe it. Every correction became further evidence of manipulation. Every statement from the Veil Council in support of the arrangement was framed as political pressure. Sale's own voice was absent from the debate, because Sale had never spoken publicly and had no public presence at all, and her silence was interpreted by the people who wanted to interpret it as the silence of someone who could not speak freely. Cole received a formal communication from humanity's diplomatic representative, asking if he wanted to issue a statement. He wrote back 2 sentences. He said that he did not, and that he trusted people who were paying attention to find the actual facts without him performing for them. His diplomatic representative sent a slightly frustrated reply. Cole did not respond to that one. The second trouble was more personal. His name was Dale Pruitt. Dale had been Cole's commanding officer in the 2nd year of the war, before a disagreement about orders had ended their professional relationship badly. The disagreement, in Cole's account, had involved Dale instructing the unit to leave wounded soldiers behind during a retreat in order to move faster. Cole had refused. He had gotten his wounded soldiers out. He had also gotten 3 additional soldiers killed in the process of doing it. Whether that outcome justified his decision was a debate that had never been fully settled between them, and Dale had carried the unresolved edge of it for 4 years. He had since left military service and gone into private security contracting, which in practice meant he worked for whoever paid well and asked few questions. He had developed ties to the faction within the Kethari political structure that was behind the editorial campaign, not because he had strong feelings about alien politics, but because they needed someone credible to put in certain rooms and say certain things, and he fit the profile. Dale arrived on Sale's homeworld under the credentials of a minor diplomatic observer, and spent his first 2 days attending the kind of formal gatherings where no one looks too hard at who is in the room. He spoke to the right people. He described Cole in careful terms, not as a bad soldier, which no one would have believed, but as an unstable one. A man using a foreign princess to process his war trauma. A soldier who had lost his whole team and was now attaching himself to a vulnerable and isolated alien woman because he did not know how to live a normal life. The story was delivered with the measured concern of someone who knew Cole personally and was worried about him, which made it land differently than an outright attack. On his 3rd night on the planet, Dale walked into the forest. He took the eastern path. It was late afternoon, and the light was going amber through the trees, and he walked with the slow, deliberate pace of someone who knows exactly where they are going, and has already decided what they are going to say when they get there. He was not carrying a weapon. He did not need one. What he was carrying was the specific cold calculation of a person who intends to use a situation for their own purposes. The quiet planning of someone who has decided that another person is a resource. Sale felt him before she saw him. She was in her tower, sitting by the window with a book in her lap. The feeling came first, that particular quality of intent that had always been the sharpest and most unpleasant thing her gift could detect. Not simple anger, not grief, not even fear. Calculation. The cold, organized feeling of someone treating a situation as a problem to be solved to their advantage. It moved through the trees toward her tower like a slow wave of cold water. She had spent her entire life retreating from sensation. She did not retreat. She sat very still at her window and thought clearly and deliberately for about 2 minutes. Then she sent a message to Cole. Not a distress call, not a demand. 3 veiled words that translated roughly as, "I see him." Cole was in the village at the time, picking up supplies from the cellar he had developed a comfortable weekly routine with. He read the message, set down the bag he was carrying, and walked back into the forest. He did not send any message ahead. He simply walked at the pace of a man who has decided something, and does not need to rush it, because the decision is already made. He came out of the trees onto the eastern path about 30 meters ahead of Dale. The 2 men looked at each other. The path was narrow, and the trees pressed in on both sides, and the afternoon light came through in long, slanted bars. They stood in the same silence for a moment. The specific silence between 2 people who know each other's history well enough to not need a preamble. Then Cole said one sentence. No recording existed of what that sentence was. The older of Sale's 2 servants, who had been watching from the tower window, reported only that it was short, and that Dale had listened to it with a very still face, and then turned and walked back the way he had come. Dale left the planet the following morning. He did not return. The faction he had been working for lost 3 seats in the next Kethari Council election 6 months later, partly due to an investigative report by a journalist who had been quietly following the money behind the editorial campaign. The political firestorm took longer to die. It was Sale who ended it. She had never spoken publicly in her life. The thought of composing something the whole galaxy would read, something that would produce reactions in millions of strangers that she would then have to feel the echo of, was the kind of challenge she had always understood to be beyond her reach. But she sat with it for 2 days, alone in her tower, and she understood that the alternative was to let other people define her story in ways that had nothing to do with the truth of her life. On the 3rd day, she wrote a statement. It was 11 sentences long. She did not send it through the Vale Council. She did not have it edited or reviewed by diplomats. She submitted it directly to the 3 largest galactic press networks simultaneously, under her own name, with her official seal. In it she said plainly that no one had claimed her. She said she had chosen her own life, and continued to choose it every day. She said the human who lived 200 meters from her tower had never asked her to be anything other than exactly what she was. She said she had spent 29 years being treated as a problem the world could not accommodate, and that she was not willing to spend one more day as a symbol in someone else's political argument. Not on any side, for any purpose. The statement was translated into 41 languages. It was read over 2 billion times. It was shared without comment by 12 heads of state. Cole read it sitting on his doorstep on a cool evening, with a cup of something warm in his hands. He read it twice. Then he set down his cup, walked the 200 meters to the tower, and knocked on the door. She opened it. He said, "That was very well written." She looked at him for a moment. The markings on her forearms shifted into a color that meant something close to quiet satisfaction. She said she had been angry when she wrote it, and that anger had apparently been useful. He said, in his experience, it usually was. She stepped aside to let him in. It was the first time he had come inside the tower. The old servants, watching from the kitchen doorway, exchanged a look that required no words at all. The human soldier chose the most reclusive alien princess as his prize. Part 5. What the prize actually was. A year had passed since the peace summit at Aravel's Crossing. The galaxy had not become a perfect place in that year. It never did, and no serious person expected it to. The post-Dominion political landscape was still complicated, still shifting, still full of species that did not entirely trust each other, working side by side on problems too large to solve alone. Humanity had its full seat at the council table, and was learning, slowly, and with the occasional embarrassing stumble, how to be a significant power in a world with a very long memory. But the war was over. That was real. And the particular brutality that the Dominion had made ordinary, the systematic crushing of smaller civilizations, the cold arithmetic of species deemed too weak to matter, that was over too. Not permanently, perhaps, in the long view of history, but over for now. Over enough for people to breathe again. Cole Navarro was not at the council table. He had been offered a formal role in the diplomatic corps twice, and had declined both times. His formal military service had ended with a quiet ceremony that he had attended in plain clothes, shaken several hands, said thank you to the people worth thanking, and then left. He had gone back to the forest, back to the stone house 200 meters from the tower, back to the garden. The garden was doing considerably better now. Sale had told him, in the early months, which plants belonged in which soil, and which ones needed more water than the local rain provided. She had not delivered this information in formal lessons, but in passing observations, standing at the stone wall, watching him work, and saying things like, "That will not survive there," or "Move those ones closer to the wall where the shade is." He had listened to all of it, and adjusted accordingly, without argument, in the same way he listened to everything she said, fully, without distraction. The garden now produced more than he needed most weeks. He left the surplus in a basket by the road, for whoever in the village wanted it. The village had grown comfortable with him over the year, in the easy, gradual way that small communities become comfortable with a quiet person, who shows up consistently and does not cause problems. He was known by name at the supply cellar, at the small place that served food in the evenings, at the house of an old couple who kept birds, and from whom he had bought several tools over the months. Sale came to the village twice that year. Both times with him, both times brief, both times during the quiet mid-morning hours when foot traffic was low. He walked slowly beside her and said nothing that drew attention to them. She moved through the small streets with the careful stillness of someone learning to walk on ice, testing each step, finding the safe patches. Both times she made it through and came home intact, and both times she sat on the stone wall afterward for a long time, looking at nothing in particular, working through what she had absorbed. He sat nearby on both occasions and said nothing until she was ready. The second time, coming home, she told him it was easier than the first time. He said he expected it would keep getting easier if she wanted it to. She said she was considering it. He said that was enough. In the 10th month, a young veiled diplomat named Ori Vaish, 24 years old, newly appointed to the Cultural Relations Division, deeply interested in interspecies psychology, submitted a formal request to interview Cole for an academic paper he was writing on the human presence in post-war galactic society. Cole agreed to one interview. The interview ran for 3 hours. Most of what Cole said in that interview was practical and unquotable in the way most practical things are. He talked about the war in measured terms. He talked about human adaptation as a survival mechanism rather than a special gift. He talked about what it had been like to sit at the Peace Summit surrounded by species with thousands of years of galactic history, while representing a civilization that had been traveling between stars for less than 2 centuries. Then Ori, who was young and brave in the way young researchers sometimes are, asked about Sale. Cole was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet before saying something he meant. He said that he had not chosen her as a prize. He said that word had been applied to his decision by other people, and he had never used it himself and did not intend to start. He said he had asked to meet someone he thought he might understand, and that she had agreed to meet him on her own terms, and that everything after that had been her choice as much as his. Every step, every conversation, every morning she decided the space between their homes was still a space she wanted to exist. Ori asked what had made him think he would understand her. Cole thought about this for longer than he had thought about anything else in the interview. He said that he had spent 6 years in a war where the most dangerous thing was not the enemy. It was the noise. The constant noise of 100 people's fear and urgency and need pressing in from all sides, demanding responses, demanding decisions, demanding performance. He said that he had learned in those years to find a place inside himself that the noise could not reach, not because he did not feel it, but because he had discovered that feeling it and being controlled by it were 2 different things. He said that when he read the brief description of Sale at the summit, a woman for whom the world was simply too loud, he had recognized something. He did not explain further. He did not need to. Ori's paper was published 6 weeks later. It was titled, in the formal academic style, A Study in Interspecies Adaptation and Chosen Quietude. It was 48 pages long and contained a great deal of careful scholarship. But what got quoted was a single paragraph near the end, where Ori, allowing himself one moment of opinion in an otherwise measured document, wrote that what he had observed was not the story of a warrior claiming a prize, but the story of 2 people who had each spent most of their lives carrying more than they were supposed to carry, and who had found, without planning to, that carrying it was less work, side by side. The paper was translated into 39 languages. It was read by more people than most academic papers ever reach. It was shared by Galactic Council members and village teachers and young soldiers sitting in transit ships between postings, who did not know exactly why the paragraph about quiet and noise hit them the way it did, but knew that it did. Sale read it alone in her tower on a rainy afternoon. She read it twice. Then she set it on the table, walked downstairs, and went out into the rain to sit on the stone wall. Cole came out of the house after a few minutes. He looked at her sitting in the rain, her silver skin bright in the gray light. her markings running a slow, warm amber. He went back inside and came back with something to put over his shoulders, and then sat on the doorstep in the rain, the way he sat everywhere, simply, without complaint. After a while she said that the diplomat had written about them without making it into something embarrassing. Cole said he thought the man had been fair. She said she did not usually like being written about. He said he understood. She said she had not minded this time. He said nothing. The rain came down through the trees, and the garden caught it, and the stone wall held it in shallow pools that reflected the gray sky. She asked him after a while if he ever thought about going back to the life he had left behind when he moved into the stone house. He considered the question seriously, the way he considered things, without rushing toward an answer. Then he said that he had spent a long time believing that home was a place behind him, something he had left, something that existed in the past, in the shape of a city, or a unit, or a life before the war. He said he had found, recently, that it was not behind him at all. She looked at him. The markings on her forearms shifted slowly from amber into the deep, steady gold that her people used for the word that did not translate cleanly into other languages. The word that meant, depending on who was saying it, and to whom, something between home, and chosen, and finally. He did not know the word yet. He was still learning her language in the slow, patient way he learned everything. Through observation, through attention, through the willingness to be wrong a few times before being right. But he saw the color, and he had seen it often enough by now to understand that it was not a difficult color. It was not a complicated one. It was a warm one. He looked back at the garden in the rain. The carrots had been moved to better soil 2 months ago and were coming in well. The wall he had repaired was holding. The path between the house and the tower was worn smooth now, from a year of use in both directions, from things left and things returned, and 2 pairs of feet moving quietly through the space between. The candle in her tower was lit. The garden was growing. They sat in the rain and said nothing, which was the only thing that needed to be said. That was the whole of it. That was everything. End. The human soldier chose the most reclusive alien princess as his prize.